The night Saskia of the Ashmarsh clan took off her own leather half-mask, 3 things happened that the smokehouse rafters had been waiting 4 years to witness. The first was the sound of the iron clasp at her temple unbuckling, a small, dry click that should not have carried, and yet seemed to ring through the whole holding like a struck bell. The second was the lift of cold air against the puckered ridge of scar tissue down the left side of her face. 4 winters' worth of hidden skin meeting its first honest draught of moonlight. The third, and this is the one her sisters would never forgive her for, was the slow, taut pull of a thread inside her chest, answering the man who had just set his boot on the smokehouse stair. As if her ribs were a loom, and someone, somewhere, had finally remembered how to weave. What she did not yet know, though she had suspected for 3 weeks, was that the man climbing toward her had been hearing that hum since his horse crossed the Ashmarsh border at noon, that he had stood through her sister's presentation feast with a politeness so cold it had frosted the wine, that he had not so much as glanced at the veiled cousin Vela had powdered and rehearsed for 2 months, and that the inner thing inside him, the wolf that did not lie, had been growling one short sentence on a loop since the second course. Up there. She is up there. Saskia heard the boot on the 7th stair, the one that always groaned, and she did not flinch. She had pressed copied ledgers under that very stair since she was 17, sheets of her sister's clumsy handwriting recording the steady markdown of her own bride price. 800 head of cattle becoming 6, becoming 4, becoming a single bull, and a promise of a son to a minor alpha 3 valleys over, who liked his mates damaged because damaged mates did not run. She had read every line. She had copied every line. She had folded the copies under floorboards because some part of her, the part her sisters had tried hardest to brand out of her, had always known that a king would come up these stairs one night and would need to know exactly who had done what to whom. The boot on the 8th stair. The 9th. The loft door, which had no lock because broken women were not granted locks, eased open on its leather hinge, and Alpha King Rhetor of the Northern Reach filled the frame the way weather fills a window. He was tall in the way old trees are tall, not showy, simply uncontestable, and the firelight from the brazier behind her caught the scar that ran from his right brow into his hairline and turned it briefly silver. His eyes, when they found her, were not the courtly gray she had been told to expect. They were the color of a wolf at dusk, and they were already wet. He did not speak at first. He looked at her face, the whole of her face, the smooth right side and the ruined left, the puckered, black-edged ridge where ironwood had been pressed and held and held and held, while her sisters counted to 100. And his jaw did the thing the songs always promised an Alpha King's jaw would do at a moment like this. It flexed. It locked. A muscle leapt in his throat. And then, because he was who he was, he did not lunge for her, did not shout, did not call for guards. He took one slow breath through his nose, the way a wolf scents a wounded thing it does not want to startle, and he said her name. Saskia. He said it the way another man might have said a prayer he had given up on years ago and just rediscovered intact. Saskia. Just that. She had expected, if any of this ever happened, to be the one undone. Instead, it was the king who looked, for one breath, as if his knees might consider the floorboards. She set the half-mask down on the windowsill with a steadiness that surprised her, the leather warm from her cheek, the inner lining stained dark from 4 years of weeping wound. She turned fully toward him. The brazier light fell across the ridged scar and did not flatter it, and did not need to. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was rough from disuse, but level. "I have been waiting for you." The wolf inside him made a sound she felt in her sternum before she heard it. A low, rolling thing that was not threat, but recognition. And the thread in her chest went from taut to singing. And somewhere, 2 floors below, in the great hall, her sister Vela laughed at a joke the king was no longer present to hear. He crossed the loft in 3 strides and stopped exactly 1 pace from her, close enough that she could smell the cold of the road still on his cloak. Pine and iron, and something warmer underneath, like banked embers. He did not touch her. That, more than anything, told her what kind of man stood in front of her, because every alpha she had ever read about in her sister's romances would have grabbed first and asked second. And this one was holding his own hands at his sides as if they had been instructed and were barely obeying. "May I?" he said, and his voice was the low, rough thing the songs had promised. "May I look?" She understood he did not mean look at her face, because he was already doing that. He meant the scar. He meant permission to see it the way a healer sees a wound, not the way a husband sees a flaw. She tilted her chin a fraction, the smallest assent, and rhetor of the northern reach went down on 1 knee on her warped loft floorboards so that his eyes were lower than hers. And only then did he lift 1 gloved hand and, with a gentleness that did not match the size of him, brush his knuckle along the air a finger's width from the puckered ridge of her cheek. Not touching, just tracing, as if he were memorizing a map of every cruelty done to her, so he could later visit each one in person. "Ironwood," he said, and it was not a question. "Pressed and held," she said. "By Rogue, the official story goes. By my sisters, the true one." The wolf-gray eyes did not widen. They simply darkened, the pupils blooming, and the air in the loft got a degree colder and a degree closer all at once. "How old?" he said. 15, she said. "The night before my presentation feast. They told the clan a rogue had mauled me and that I was too disfigured to be seen. They have been negotiating my bride price downward ever since, to alphas who like their mates broken because broken mates do not run." He closed his eyes. Just once. A long blink, like a man absorbing a blow he had been bracing for and that had still landed harder than expected. When he opened them again, something in his face had been put away for later, locked in a back room she suspected was where he kept the things he intended to do to her sisters when the time came. "And the gift," he said, very quietly. The fact that he knew there was a gift, that he had known before he climbed the stair, before he lifted a mask he had not had to lift because she had lifted it for him, told her the last thing she needed to know about who he was and what he had ridden 3 weeks to find. She drew breath. "They thought," she said, "that ironwood would burn it out of me. That if they pressed the brand long enough and deep enough, my first shift would never come, and the gift behind it would die quiet in the dark." He waited. He did not finish her sentence for her. That alone was a courtesy she had not known she was starved for. "Instead," she said, and her voice did not shake but the loft floorboards did, very faintly, under her bare feet. "Instead, it has been pressed against the seal for 4 years with nowhere to go." He looked at her, and the wolf in him looked at her, and both of them understood the same arithmetic at the same instant. "A dam," he said. "A dam," she agreed. He stood, slowly. He did not back away. He simply stood to his full height again, and now they were close enough that she could see the small white scar through his lower lip, and the place where his stubble had not quite filled in over an old wound at his jaw. And she thought, with a calm that surprised her, "Oh, so this is what the songs were trying to describe, and they did a poor job of it." Below, a horn sounded. The feast was calling for the next course, and her sister Mara's voice floated up faintly, sweetly, calling for the king's pleasure, asking where his grace had wandered. Rhetor did not so much as turn his head. "Saskia of the Ash Marsh," he said, and her name in his mouth was the near caress the songs had also tried and failed to describe. "Will you come down those stairs with me?" She thought of the ledgers under the 7th step. She thought of 4 years of loft dust in her hair. She thought of Vela's powdered cousin standing veiled by the high table, of Mara's careful smile, of the bull and a son contract drying on her father's desk. "Yes," she said. "But first, Your Grace, there is something under the 7th stair you will want to read." He went down ahead of her because she asked him to, and on the 7th step, he knelt a second time that night and pried up the warped board with the edge of a dagger she had not seen him draw. The cavity beneath was deeper than a stranger would guess. Saskia had widened it herself with a stolen chisel over the course of one summer, and into it she had pressed, layer by patient layer, every scrap of her sister's negotiation she had ever managed to copy. Bride price ledgers in Vela's looping hand, letters from Mara to a minor alpha in the Wend Valley, promising a northern bloodline son in exchange for grazing rights. A list in their father's spidery script of which clan elders had been bribed to repeat the rogue-mauling story at council, and what each had been paid. And, folded smallest and pressed deepest, a single sheet she had copied from her mother's old grimoire on the night before the smokehouse. A sheet describing in plain herbal language exactly what black ironwood does to a shifter daughter on the eve of her first transformation, and exactly which of Saskia's sisters had asked their mother 3 separate times where the grimoire was kept. Rhetor read in silence. He read the way he had climbed the stair, methodically, missing nothing. When he reached the grimoire page, his gloved hand closed around it slowly, and Saskia watched the leather creak. He did not crumple it. He folded it with great care and tucked it inside his coat against his ribs, as if it were a thing too precious and too damning to be carried anywhere but next to his heart. Then he gathered the rest, every sheet, and stood and turned to her on the stair below. "You have been building this case," he said, "since you were 17. "Since I understood," she said, "that no one was coming who did not already know to look for it." Something passed across his face then that was not tenderness exactly, though tenderness was in it. It was closer to the look a craftsman gives another craftsman whose work he has just recognized as better than his own. He inclined his head, a small bow, from a king, on a smokehouse stair, to a girl in a flour-dusted shift with a ruined cheek and bare feet. "Behind your mask," he said, "you have been a court of one. Walk with me, Saskia." They came down into the great hall together, and the hall did the thing halls do when something irreversible has just walked into them. The harper missed a string. A serving girl froze with a ewer half-tilted. Vela, at the high table, in her ice blue gown with her hair wound in the 8 braids of an unmarried alpha's daughter, turned her head and saw her sister's bare face for the first time in 4 years, in front of 300 witnesses. And the color drained from her own face so fast, Saskia almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Mara, beside Vela, did better. Mara had always been the cleverer one. Mara's hand only tightened on her wine cup, and her smile only thinned. And Saskia watched her sister's eyes flicker to the king, to the bare scar, to the king again, and begin, even now, to calculate. The veiled cousin at the high table, poor pawn, simply began to cry quietly behind her gauze. Their father, old Alpha Turvin, stood up too fast and knocked his chair.
Your Grace, he began. This is... The broken one should not. She has not been presented. She is not fit for.
Rhetor did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply set the stack of ledgers down on the high table, on top of the roast, with a soft, heavy sound, and the whole went still. Then he laid the grimoire page on top of the stack, unfolded, and weighted it with the hilt of his dagger, so the firelight caught the writing. "Read," he said. Turvin did not move. Mara reached, very slowly, for the topmost ledger, and Rhetor said, without looking at her, "Not you." Turvin read. The hall watched Turvin's face do, in public, what Vila's had done in private, and Saskia stood at the king's left elbow with her scar in full firelight and felt, for the first time in 4 years, the loft dust shake out of her hair. "Father," Vila said, her voice high, "this is a forgery. She has always been jealous. She has always—" "Be quiet," Mara murmured, not looking at her. Vila, mercifully for everyone, was quiet. Rhetor turned to the hall, all of it. The long benches of vassal alphas and minor cousins and herald boys and serving women, and he did not raise his voice for them either. "By the ancient right of recognition," he said, "which supersedes contract, kin, and prior obligation, I name the daughter standing at my left as the bonded mate of the Northern Reach. Any contract negotiated for her hand without her witnessed consent is void. Any voice raised against her in this hall from this hour forward is raised against me." The vow landed like a thrown stone in still water. Somewhere at the back of the hall, an old woman, one of the kitchen grandmothers, began to weep. Saskia did not weep. Saskia looked at her sisters across the high table, at Vila's stricken white face and Mara's calculating one, and she thought, with that same odd calm, "You spent 4 years teaching me to stand still under pain. You really should not have." They rode out of the ash marsh holding before dawn, because Rhetor would not have her sleep one more night under that roof, and because he had a column of 40 northern riders camped a half-league off who had been waiting since noon for any signal that meant ride in or ride out. He gave the signal for ride out, gently, and bundled Saskia into a fur-lined cloak that smelled of him, of pine and iron and banked embers, and lifted her onto his own saddle in front of him. Because she had not ridden in 4 years and her legs were unsteady, and he had made, somewhere between the ledgers and the vow, a private decision that her feet were not going to touch unfamiliar ground again until she chose where they touched. Her father had not spoken further. Her sisters had been escorted, with great courtesy and absolutely no negotiation, to separate locked rooms pending a council inquiry that the king had announced in the same level voice he had used for the recognition vow. The veiled cousin had been given a clean handkerchief and a seat by the fire, and, later, a quiet promise that her own betrothal would not be held against her. Saskia rode through the cold pre-dawn, pressed against the king's chest, with his cloak around her shoulders and his arm braced across her ribs. And for the first hour she did not speak, because she did not trust her voice, and he, reading this with the same accuracy he had read the ledgers, did not require her to. The country between Ashmarsh and the Northern Reach is high stony moor for 2 days, and then climbs into pine forest and granite. And they took it slowly because of her, with frequent halts, and at every halt, Rhetor lifted her down himself and set her on a folded blanket and brought her warm broth from the rider's kettle in his own hands. He did not ask her to remove the cloak. He did not ask her to show the scar to his men. He did not parade her. The riders, for their part, treated her with a courtesy so careful it bordered on reverence, and Saskia, who had been sneered at and pitied in roughly equal measure for 4 years, did not know at first what to do with reverence, And so she did the only thing she could think of, which was to thank each man by name when he brought her water or steadied her stirrup, and to learn their names by the second halt. By the third halt, one of the youngest, a freckled rider called Shane, who could not have been more than 19, was blushing every time she looked at him. The captain of the column, an older gray-bearded man named Nevada, whose calm reminded her of certain trees, watched this and smiled into his beard and said nothing. On the second night, they camped in the lee of a stone ridge, and Rhetor set her bedroll inside his own tent and his own bedroll across the entrance like a drawn line. And Saskia, who had slept 4 years on a loft pallet with her back to a wall, lay in the warm dark listening to him breathe, and felt against her sternum the thread hum. Not painfully, just steadily, as if it had been waiting for her to be still enough to notice. She slept and dreamed, for the first time in years, of running on 4 feet through snow. In the morning, Rhetor was already up, and a small gray kitchen cat had appeared from somewhere among the supply bags and was standing on his bedroll with absolute proprietary confidence, kneading. He looked up at Saskia from under this small gray tyrant with an expression of such helpless dignity that she laughed, actually laughed, a sound she had not made in front of another person in 4 years. And the king of the Northern Reach went very still under the cat and watched her laugh with the same expression he had worn on the smokehouse stair, the one that said, "I have been writing 3 weeks for this, and it was worth every hour." The cat, whose name turned out to be no one's because she had simply joined the column at some unremembered village, climbed onto Saskia's lap at the breakfast fire and would not be moved. And Nevada, the gray-bearded captain, observed mildly that the cat had impeccable taste. And Shane, the freckled rider, tried to offer the cat a piece of bacon and was hissed at. And Saskia, scratching the small gray skull, felt something in her own chest unknot a quarter turn. She named the cat Tarah, after a kitchen grandmother who had slipped her bread crusts in the loft years. And Tarah accepted this with the air of one finally being addressed correctly. Rhetor watched all of this, and at one point his hand drifted, almost without his knowing, to rest very lightly at the small of Saskia's back, where the cloak met the bedroll, and she did not move away from it. And he, registering this, exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding since the smokehouse. At midday on the third day, they crested the last ridge and the Northern Reach opened below them. A long river valley silvered with thaw, the King's Hold a dark crown of stone on a far hill, banners visible even at that distance, the wind off the high pines smelling of green and snowmelt and wood smoke. Saskia, who had not been farther from the ash marsh holding than the woodyard fence in 4 years, looked down at this and discovered her face was wet. Rhetor did not comment. He simply tightened his arm a fraction around her ribs and let her cry without fanfare, the way a good man holds a horse through thunder, present and unhurrying. And the column rode down into the valley at a walk, so that she could see all of it. She had been 3 weeks at the Northern Reach Hold when the first real attempt on her life came. And by then, enough of the household had fallen quietly in love with her that the attempt failed before it properly began. The hold itself was older than Ashmarsh by centuries, all dark stone and pine beams and long galleries where firelight pooled like honey. And Rhetor had given her the south solar with its 3 tall windows facing the valley, because he had noticed on the first night that she preferred sun to shadow, and because, he said in a voice that did not quite admit to itself what it was admitting, he wanted her to wake into light from now on. The household had been told only that the king had brought home his bonded mate, and that her face bore an old wound she was free to cover or uncover as she chose. And the household, taking their tone from their king, had received this information without comment, and had then proceeded, in the way of households, to adopt her. The kitchen grandmothers fed her honey and oat porridge and clucked at her bony wrists. The stable boys saved her the gentlest of the mares. The hold's old healer, a woman named Everly whose hands were knotted with age and whose eyes were kind, examined the scar with such professional gentleness that Saskia, who had not been touched on the left side of her face by anyone but herself in 4 years, had to grip the arms of her chair. "Ironwood," Everly said, the same flat statement rhetor had made, and then, more softly, "Child, I cannot undo what is done to the skin. But the dam underneath, that I can read. May I?" Saskia let her read. Everly laid both knotted hands on either side of Saskia's face, scarred cheek and smooth, closed her eyes, and was silent for a long moment. When she opened her eyes again, she looked at rhetor, who was standing by the window with his arms folded, and she said, "Your Grace, the seal is failing." He had been waiting for this. He nodded once. "How long?" he said. "Days," Everly said. "A week at the outside. The bond's pull is loosening it from the inside, and once it goes, it will go all at once, and she will need someone who knows what to do." "I know what to do," Rhetor said. "So do I," said Everly. And she patted Saskia's hand. "You will not be alone, child." Saskia, who had spent 4 years assuming her first shift would never come because the brand had killed it, sat very still and tried to absorb the information that the brand had not killed it, had merely held it, and that the holding was about to end, and that the thing waking up under the scar was not a small thing. Rhetor, reading her face, crossed the solar and crouched at her chair the way he had knelt on the smokehouse stair and the woodyard step, and he took her hands in his ungloved ones for the first time, and his palms were warm and calloused and absolutely steady. "Saskia," he said, "look at me." She looked. "Whatever wakes," he said, "I will be there. Whatever it costs you, I will pay half. Whatever shape you take, I will know you." The thread in her chest sang, low and clear, and Tarah the cat, who had taken up permanent residence on the Solar's windowsill, made a small approving chirp. Saskia drew breath. "All right," she said. "All right." The attempt on her life came 2 nights after that conversation, and it came, as Rhetor had expected, from inside the hold. A serving girl who had been planted in the kitchen 6 months before any of this began, on retainer from a southern faction that had its own opinions about northern bloodlines marrying border clan daughters with awakening gifts, slipped a pinch of powdered ironwood into the honey jar set aside for the South Solar. Tarah the cat, who had developed strong views about the honey jar, jumped onto the tray as the girl carried it up, sniffed once, and went absolutely rigid with her ears flat and her tail bottle-brushed, and yowled. The yowl brought Nevada, who had been stationed in the gallery on the king's standing order, and Nevada, who had spent 40 years reading cats and serving girls, took one look at the girl's face and at the cat's posture, and quietly relieved the girl of the tray. The honey jar was tested. The girl was questioned. By dawn, the southern faction was named. The girl was in custody and weeping and giving up handlers, and Tarah the cat was eating poached fish off Rhetor's own plate at the breakfast table, with the air of one who had earned it. Saskia, who had come down to breakfast in a soft gray gown with her scar uncovered because she had decided that morning to stop covering it inside her own home, listened to Nevada's report and watched her king feed her cat fish, and felt the thread in her chest go from singing, just something closer to a roar, banked but rising. She set her spoon down. "Rhetor," she said calmly. He looked up. "The dam is going to fail in front of someone who means me harm, isn't it?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. He did not soften it. She loved him a little more for that. "Then we should be ready," she said, and Tarah the cat, pleased, headbutted the king's wrist for more fish. The almost kiss happened that same night in the small library off the South Solar, and was interrupted, as such things are, by a horn. They had taken to spending the hour before sleep there together, because Saskia, who had been forbidden books for 4 years, had discovered that the Northern Reach Hold had a library of 900 volumes, and that the king of it would read aloud to her by firelight if she asked. And she had asked on the second night, and every night since. He read like a man who had not been read to as a child, and was discovering, in his 30s, what reading aloud was for. His voice in the lower registers did things to the thread in her chest that she did not have language for. On this particular night, he had been reading her an old northern saga, a long, winding thing about a queen who had bargained with a winter spirit for her brother's life. And Saskia had been curled in the chair across from his, with tarah on her feet and a cup of warm, spiced wine in her hand. And at some point in the last hour, the chair had become a footstool, and she had drifted, without quite meaning to sit on the rug at his knee. And at some further point, his hand had come to rest in her hair. Lightly, the way one rests a hand on something beloved without expecting anything from it. He read on. She listened. The fire popped. When he finished the chapter and closed the book, she did not move from his knee, and he did not move his hand from her hair. And the silence that fell between them was the kind that has weight. She tipped her head back to look up at him. The firelight caught her scar and did not flatch it, and they had both stopped pretending it did. His hand slid, very slowly, from her hair to the line of her jaw, and his thumb traced, for the first time, the upper edge of the ridged scar, not avoiding it, not making a thing of it, simply touching her face the way a man touches the face of the woman he intends to spend the rest of his life touching. "Saskia," he said, low. "Yes," she said. He bent. She rose to meet him. Their breath caught at the same moment, a hand's width apart, his other hand cradling the back of her skull now, hers braced flat against his chest where she could feel his heart doing something unkingly, and the thread in her chest pulled tight enough to ache. And his eyes, very close to hers, were entirely wolf for one long heartbeat, gold-rimmed and reverent, and his mouth was almost on hers, almost, when the watch horn at the gate went off. 2 long blasts, then 3 short. Riders. Unannounced. Hostile pace. Rhetor went absolutely still against her mouth. He breathed out, once, a long, careful breath that did not move from where it was, and he said, very softly against her lips, "I am going to remember exactly where we stopped." She laughed because she could not help it, a small breath of a laugh, and said, "I will hold you to that, Your Grace." And he made a low, pained sound that was at least half wolf, and pulled back and stood and was, in the time it took her to rise, the king again, cloak swung, sword belted, voice already pitched for command. "Nevada," he said as the gallery door opened on the captain who had clearly been listening for the horn himself. "Banner." "Ashmarsh," Nevada said, grim. "Both daughters in the party. Under flag of parley." Saskia, who had been arranging her gown with hands that were only a little unsteady, went still. "Vila," she said, "and Mara, they are not in custody then." "They escaped the council inquiry 6 days ago," Nevada said, apologetic. "The writer with the news only reached us this evening. We were going to tell you in the morning. They have ridden hard. They are at the gate." Rhetor turned to her. "Saskia," he said, "you do not have to see them." "I know," she said. "I am going to." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he inclined his head, that same small bow he had given her on the smokehouse stair, and he said, "Then we will receive them in the great hall, together, with the household as witness." Tarah the cat, who had been displaced from Saskia's feet, stalked to the door with her tail high, registering an opinion. They received Vila and Mara in the great hall a quarter-hour later, and Saskia came down the gallery stair on the king's arm in the soft gray gown, with her scar uncovered, and her hair loose, and a small gray cat trotting at her heel. And the household, ranged along the long benches as witnesses by the king's quiet word, watched her come down, the way one watches weather change. Vila, in the center of the hall, in a travel-stained version of the ice-blue gown, saw her sister whole-faced and unmasked, and attended and adored, and the calculation in her face this time was naked. Mara, at her shoulder, was paler and steadier and far more dangerous. "Sister," Vila said, and her voice was already pitched for the room. "Sister, please, we have ridden so far. We only want to explain. We were children. We did not know. We were frightened of what you would become." Saskia stopped 3 steps from the dais. Tarah sat by her foot and stared at Vila with her ears half flat. Saskia did not answer her sister. She turned her head very slightly toward Mara. "You knew," she said. Mara held her gaze. Mara, who had always been cleverer, did not bother to lie to her sister's face in front of 300 witnesses. Mara only smiled, faintly, the smile of a woman whose final card has not yet been played, and said, "Sister, you have no idea what I knew." The thread in Saskia's chest, which had been singing, began to roar. What Mara had not told Vela, what Mara had been keeping back through 3 weeks of council inquiry and 6 days of hard writing and the long, careful walk into the great hall, was that she had brought ironwood. Not a brand this time, a blade. A short, narrow thing the length of a hand, hammered from the same black metal that had ruined Saskia's face at 15, sheathed along the inside of Mara's forearm under the travel cloak, and meant, Saskia understood with sudden cold clarity, not for her. Mara had not ridden 6 days to kill her sister. Mara had ridden 6 days to kill the king. Because Mara, who had always been the cleverer of the two and had spent 4 years orchestrating the markdown of her sister's bride price for one specific reason, had understood from the moment the recognition vow landed in the Ash Marsh Hall that the only way to undo what had been done that night was to remove the man who had done it, before the bond went deep enough to anchor the gift, and she had calculated, correctly, that the inner ring of the Northern Reach hold would be the only place she would ever get close enough. Saskia saw the shape of Mara's arm under the cloak and understood all of this in the same heartbeat that the thread in her chest went from roar to white. "Mara," Saskia said, very quietly. Mara's smile thinned. Mara moved. She was fast. 4 years of pretending to be the dutiful elder sister had not dulled her, and she came off the floor of the hall toward the dais in 3 running strides, with the ironwood blade out and low, and aimed exactly where it needed to be aimed. At the seam under Rhetor's ribs, where a king's mail was always a finger thinner. 2 things happened at the same instant. Rhetor moved to put his body between the blade and Saskia, which was what every Alpha King in every song had always done, and what his wolf had been screaming at him to do since the gallery horn. And Saskia, who had spent 4 years in a loft above a woodyard, learning that no one was coming for her except the version of herself she built, moved to put her body between the blade and Rhetor, because she had also understood, in that same heartbeat, exactly who the blade was for. They collided on the lowest step of the dais. His arm came around her ribs to sweep her behind him. Her hands came up flat against his chest to push him back. Mara reached them. The blade went in. It went in low, under Saskia's outstretched hand, into the soft place above her own hip, because she had stepped into it on purpose to keep it out of him. And the ironwood, the substance that scars a shifter permanently and suppresses the gift, slid into a body whose gift was already cracking the seal from inside. And the dam, which Everly had said had a week, did not have a week. It had the time it took Mara to twist the blade once, which was not very long, and to look up into her sister's silver eyes and understand, much too late, what she had just woken. Saskia did not scream. She drew breath. She drew breath, and the south solar windows 2 floors up blew open at once, all 3 of them, on no wind. The fire in the great hearth dropped flat to embers and then surged up taller than a man, silver at the heart, no heat. Tarah the cat on the dais sat up very straight and began to purr, loudly, in approval. And Saskia of the Ash Marsh, with an ironwood blade buried hilt deep in her side, and her sister's hand still on the hilt, opened her mouth and let the 4 years of damned gift out. It came as silver flame, not from her hands, from the scar. The whole left side of her face, the puckered, ridged ruin her sisters had been so proud of, lit from within, silver and clean and unflinching. And the silver did not burn her. It poured out of her, down her shoulder, down her arm, along the line of her body, to where Mara's hand still gripped the ironwood hilt. And the ironwood, the unburnable substance, the metal that scars shifters permanently, began, very quietly, to unmake. It did not melt. It did not shatter. It simply, under the silver, ceased to be ironwood, the way a lie ceases to be a lie when the truth walks into the room. The blade in Saskia's side became, between one breath and the next, ordinary iron. Ordinary iron a shifter body can heal. Mara, whose hand was still on the hilt, felt the metal change under her palm, and her face did the thing Velas had done in the Ash Marsh Great Hall, the color going out of it all at once. But Mara had less time to absorb it, because the silver, having unmade the blade, ran up the blade to the hand that held it. Saskia, with the last clear thought she would have for some hours, looked into her sister's eyes and made the choice the songs always promised the heroine would make, and that she had not been certain until this exact moment that she was capable of. She pulled the silver back. She did not let it take Mara's hand. She let it take only the part of Mara that had carried ironwood into this hall with intent to kill her king, which turned out, in the strange poetry of the gift, to be the tendons of the 3 fingers Mara had used to grip the hilt. Mara's hand opened. The blade fell. Mara fell with it, to her knees, cradling a hand that would never close on a weapon again. And Saskia, with silver pouring off her scar, and her own blood pouring down her hip, and the thread in her chest singing so loudly the rafters hummed, said in a voice that was hers and also something older, "Sister, I could have unmade you. I have chosen not to. Remember this." Then her knees went. Rhetor caught her. Of course he caught her. He had been bracing for it from the instant the silver started, and his arms were already there, and he went to the floor of his own great hall, with his bonded mate cradled against his chest, and her blood soaking through his tunic, and the silver flame guttering down to a shimmer along her cheek. And he said her name, low and rough and unkingly. "Saskia. Saskia, stay." And Everly was already running from the gallery with her satchel, and Nevada had Mara on the floor under his boot, and Vela was weeping into her hands in the center of the hall, finally understanding what she had helped do at 15. And Tarah the cat was on Saskia's chest, paws kneading, purring, anchoring her to her own body. The last thing Saskia saw before the dark took her was her king's wolf-gray eyes, wet, very close to hers. And the last thing she heard was his voice saying, against her temple, "You saved me, you reckless, impossible woman. You saved me." And she thought, with great satisfaction, before the dark, well, of course I did. That was always going to be the order of it. She woke 3 days later in the South Solar with sun on her face and Tarah on her chest, and the king of the Northern Reach asleep in a chair pulled up to her bed, with one hand wrapped around hers, and his head tipped at an angle that was going to cost him later. She knew, before she opened her eyes fully, that the seal was gone. She could feel it the way one feels a long-held breath finally let out. The space behind her scar, which had been a dam for 4 years, was simply a part of her now, awake and quiet and hers. The scar itself was still there. She lifted her free hand and traced it, and the rigid tissue was the same rigid tissue, puckered and permanent. And she discovered that she did not mind. It was a map of what had been done to her and what she had done with it. And a map is not a wound. A map is a record. Rhetor woke at the small movement of her hand, the way wolves wake, all at once, no grogginess. His eyes found hers. He did not speak for a moment. He simply looked at her, alive in his bed, in his sun. And his throat worked, and Saskia, who had loved him already, loved him a little more for the fact that he did not hide the wet in his eyes from her. "Hello," she said. Her voice was a rasp. "Hello," he said. His was worse. Tarah, on her chest, had butted her chin in stern welcome and then climbed off in the manner of a cat who has done her duty and now requires breakfast. Everly came in within the half hour, alerted by some hold internal magic that Saskia suspected was simply Nevada watching the door, and pronounced the wound healing cleanly, the iron having become ordinary iron under the silver, and a shifter body being a shifter body. "The first shift," Everly said, "will come when it comes, probably soon, probably gentle because the dam is open, not bursting. You will know." Saskia nodded. She found she was not afraid. "Mara," she said. "In the cells," Rhetor said, "awaiting counsel. She will live. Her hand will not heal. She will never carry a blade again." "By her own scheme," Everly murmured, approving. "Vela," Saskia said. "Vela," Rhetor said, "has confessed everything, including the parts Mara did not let her in on. She is asking for exile rather than execution." Saskia closed her eyes. She thought about the smokehouse and the 4 years in the loft and the 7th stair and the silver flame and her sister's hand opening on the hilt because Saskia had chosen not to unmake her. And she said, "Give her exile, far, cold, alone." Rhetor inclined his head. "As you choose." "And Mara?" "Mara," Saskia said slowly, "gets to live the rest of her life as a woman whose 3 fingers do not close. Let her live it in the ash marsh holding, under guard, with the ledgers I copied read aloud once a year on the anniversary of my presentation feast in the Great Hall in front of the clan." Rhetor's mouth twitched, one corner. "That," he said, "is colder than exile." "I know," said Saskia. "Good," said the king of the Northern Reach. He lifted her hand to his mouth and kissed her knuckles, slowly, 3 times. They were married 6 weeks later in the old grove behind the hold. The one with the standing stones the locals said had been there before the hold itself, on a day of thin spring sun and high cloud. Saskia wore a gown of soft, undyed wool with silver thread at the hem, and her hair was loose, and her scar was uncovered. And Tarah the cat walked the length of the aisle ahead of her with her tail high, as if she had personally arranged the entire matter, which, in her own opinion, she had. Rhetor met her at the center stone in his northern blacks, with his sword belted and his hands, when he took hers, not quite steady. The bonding bite at the join of her shoulder and neck, when it came, was gentle and deliberate, and witnessed by every household member who could fit into the grove, and a great many who could not. And the silver hum that rose off both of them at the moment of the claim was visible to everyone present, a pale shimmer in the spring air, and Everly, watching from the front, wept openly. And Nevada, the captain, wept less openly into his beard, and the kitchen grandmothers wept into their aprons, and Shane, the freckled rider, who was 19 and in love with the entire situation, wept into his sleeve. Saskia did not weep. Saskia laughed, the same small, startled laugh she had laughed over the kitchen cat at the second halt, and her king laughed with her, low and rough, against her temple. And the thread between them, no longer a thread, more a steady, warm rope now, settled into the shape it would hold for the rest of their lives. The first shift came that night. It came the way Everly had promised, gentle because the dam was open and not bursting, and Saskia was ready for it because Rhetor had been ready for it for weeks and had walked her through what to expect every night in the small library by the fire. They went down together to the inner courtyard under the moon, and he undressed first, because he had made another of his quiet, private decisions, that her first shift would not be witnessed by her alone. And he shifted in front of her, the great dark shape of the northern wolf rising out of the man like smoke condensing, and stood, and waited, head tilted, gold-rimmed eyes on hers, patient. She breathed. She let the scar open. The silver, which had lived for 4 years as flame and now lived as something quieter, ran along her skin like water, and the woman became, between one breath and the next, a wolf the color of moonlight on stone, smaller than the king, but not by much, silver where he was dark, with one long pale streak down the left side of her muzzle, exactly where the scar had been. Because the scar, even in this shape, came with her. Because the scar was a record, and a record does not vanish. Rhetor, in his wolf shape, made a sound she felt in her ribs, half growl, half something her human mind translated as, oh. And she, in her wolf shape, walked to him on her new 4 feet, unsteady for 2 strides and steady on the 3rd, and pressed her forehead against his chest. And he lowered his great dark head over her silver one, and breathed her in, and the thread between them sang. They ran the inner courtyard once, slowly, while she found her legs, and then ran the outer courtyard, and then, because she asked with a tilt of her head, the long sloping paddock outside the hold, and Saskia of the Ash Marsh, who had been forbidden her first shift at 15, and had carried that forbidding under her cheek for 4 years, ran in moonlight on snow with her bonded mate at her shoulder, until her lungs burned and her muscles trembled, and she was so completely happy she did not have language for it. Even later, even in the warm bed they came back to, even with his arm around her and his nose in her hair, and Tarah the cat on the foot of the bed registering loud opinions about wet wolf paws on clean linen. The years that followed went the way good years go, unspectacular in the parts that matter most. Full of mornings, Everly taught Saskia what she knew of the bloodline gift, which was more than Saskia's mother had ever been allowed to learn. And Saskia learned to put silver into a healing rather than only into an unmaking, and the hold's healer ranks grew by one. The southern faction that had planted the serving girl with the powdered ironwood was unpicked patiently over 2 seasons by Nevada and a small, quiet team Saskia did not ask too many questions about. Vela, in her northern exile, wrote 1 letter a year asking for forgiveness, and received, each year, an envelope containing 1 copied ledger sheet and nothing else. Mara, in the ash marsh holding under guard, listened to the ledgers read aloud each year on the anniversary of the presentation feast, and on the 3rd such anniversary, she stopped attending court altogether and was last reported tending a small herb garden behind the holding kitchens with her ruined hand, which Saskia, when told, received with no expression at all and a very small nod. The Ashmarsh clan itself, freed of the sisters and reorganized under a distant cousin chosen by council, sent its first honest tribute to the Northern Reach in 2 generations, and was received with full courtesy. Tarah the cat lived an outrageous number of years, and ruled the South Solar with an iron paw, and was buried, when she finally consented to die, under the windowsill she had loved best, with a small carved figure of a cat set above her by the king's own hand. 3 winters after the wedding, on a morning of thin spring sun, very like the wedding morning, Saskia came into the breakfast hall with her hand resting on the small new curve of her belly, and Rhetor, who had been pouring tea for Nevada, set the pot down with great care and crossed the room and went to 1 knee in front of her on the flagstones, the way he had knelt on the smokehouse stair, the way he had knelt on the 7th step, the way he had knelt by her chair in the South Solar, and pressed his forehead against the curve of her belly, and did not speak for a long moment. She put her hand in his hair. "Yes," she said softly. He breathed out. "Saskia," he said into the wool of her gown. "Yes," she said again. The baby came in autumn, a small dark-haired girl with silver eyes and her father's mouth, and no scar at all, and she was named for the kitchen grandmother who had fed Saskia bread in the Loft years. And on the morning after the birth, Rhetor sat in the chair by the bed with his daughter asleep on his chest, and Tarah the cat asleep on his feet, and Saskia asleep against his shoulder. And he watched the sun come into the South Solar across all 3 of them, and did not move for an hour, because he did not want to wake any of them, and because he was, for the first time in his life, entirely where he wanted to be. So that is the story of how Saskia of the Ashmarsh clan came down out of the loft above the woodyard with copied ledgers under her arm, and a silver gift dammed under her cheek, and how she walked into the great hall of the Northern Reach with her king's hand at her back, and her sister's blade in her ribs, and chose mercy when the silver came, and how the scar her family had pressed into her face at 15 turned out, in the end, to be the map by which she found her way home. If this story moved you even a little, tell me where it landed for you on a scale of 1 to 10 in the comments below. And if you would like to hear more stories of underestimated women and the kings who finally see them, please do go ahead and subscribe to the channel, because there are many more nights like this one waiting to be told.